the empty faces. The gallery was buzzing with excitement, the kind of electric energy that only a new, provocative art exhibition could spark in the heart of New York. Simon Blake, a rising star in the world of photography, stood quietly in the corner, sipping champagne and watching the crowd. His new photobook, Faces of the City, had stirred both awe and unease among critics. The images, stark black and white portraits of New Yorkers, were haunting in their simplicity, until you noticed the faces. Every face in the collection was blurred, as though the camera had failed to focus. But the blur wasn't natural. The effect wasn't caused by movement or light distortion. It seemed deliberate, almost alive, as if the faces were erasing themselves. Critics called it a groundbreaking commentary on identity and anonymity, but Simon knew the truth. The faces hadn't been blurred when he took the photographs. They had changed on their own. Simon drained his glass and tried to fake off the creeping unease that had been following him since the project began. He hadn't told anyone about the change in the photos, nor about the eerie feeling that had lingered in his studio as he developed them. Rationally, he told himself it was just an artistic phenomenon, something he'd stumbled into by accident. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. As he moved through the crowd, he overheard snippets of conversation. So haunting, but beautiful. Like their souls are missing. Gives me chills. Simon stopped in front of one of his own prints. The image showed a woman standing in front of a subway entrance, her hair blowing in the wind. Her face was a blank smear, the blurred contours almost forming an expression, but not quite. He stared at the photo, a chill running down his spine. He hadn't seen her since the day he took the shot. In fact, none of the people he'd photographed had responded to his attempts to contact them afterward. A voice broke his thoughts. "Mr. Blake, incredible work." Simon turned to see a man in a sharp gray suit, his features sharp and impassive. Something about the man's presence set Simon on edge. "Thanks," Simon said, forcing a smile. "I'm glad you like it." The man extended a hand. "Nathan Cole, art enthusiast, your work is singular." Simon shook his hand but felt an odd pressure, as though Cole's grip carried more weight than it should have. "I couldn't help but notice," Cole continued, his tone casual but probing, "the way these faces seem to resist being captured, almost as if they're not meant to be seen." Simon blinked. "That's an interesting interpretation." Cole's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Tell me, Mr. Blake, have you spoken to your models recently?" The question hit Simon like a slap. His throat tightened. "Why do you ask?" Cole's eyes darkened. "Just a thought. In case you hadn't noticed, they seem to be disappearing." Simon's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "I've been following your work closely," Cole said, his voice now low and conspiratorial. "Several of the people in your photographs haven't been seen in days. Their families can't find them. Friends don't know where they've gone." Simon tried to process this. "That's impossible. I tried reaching out to some of them, but I thought—" Cole tilted his head. "You thought they were avoiding you? Perhaps they were, or perhaps they couldn't respond." Before Simon could ask what he meant, Cole stepped closer, his voice almost a whisper. "Be careful, Mr. Blake. Sometimes when we capture a moment, it captures us back." And with that, Cole disappeared into the crowd, leaving Simon with a head full of questions and a gnawing sense of dread. Later that night, Simon returned to his studio, his mind racing. Cole's words echoed in his head, intertwining with the unease he had felt since the photographs had changed. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of chemicals and ink doing little to calm his nerves. The studio was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. Simon flipped on the lights and walked over to the table where his prints were spread out. Each photo stared back at him, the blurred faces more unsettling in the silence of the empty room. He picked up a print of a man playing a saxophone in Central Park. The man's face had been full of life when Simon photographed him, cheerful, expressive. Now his features were an indistinct haze, the saxophone seeming to float in the hands of a ghost. Simon's phone buzzed on the table, making him jump. He grabbed it and saw an unknown number. "Hello? Mr. Blake?" The voice on the other end was shaky, almost frantic. "Yes, this is Simon." "Who is this?" "This is." The man hesitated, his breathing heavy. This is Michael. I I was one of your models. You took my picture near the Brooklyn Bridge. Simon's heart sank. He remembered Michael, a street performer with a wide grin and a talent for drawing crowds. What's going on? Simon asked. Are you all right? No, Michael said, his voice cracking. Something's wrong. Ever since you took that photo, I've been seeing things. Shadows. Faces in mirrors that aren't mine. Simon's stomach churned. Have you told anyone else? No, Michael whispered, but I'm scared. I think they're coming for me. Who's coming for you? Michael didn't answer. A sharp crack came through the line, followed by static. Michael? Simon said, his voice rising. Michael! The line went dead. Simon stared at his phone, his hands trembling. He looked back at the photo of Michael on the table, and his breath caught. The blurred face seemed different now, sharper. The faint contours of an expression had emerged, a look of fear. Simon stumbled back, his head spinning. The photos weren't just changing. They were alive, and they were watching him. The lights in the studio flickered, and for a moment Simon thought he saw movement in the reflection of the window. A figure stood there, just beyond the glass, a silhouette with no face. Simon backed away, his chest tightening. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room with a suffocating sense of dread. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the faint hum of the city outside. Simon sank into a chair, his mind racing. Cole's warning echoed in his head. When we capture a moment, it captures us back. Whatever was happening, Simon realized, wasn't just about the photographs. It was about him. Simon spent the rest of the night pacing in his studio. The haunting image of Michael's blurred face burned into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to the man, and the cryptic warning from Nathan Cole only deepened his unease. What did Cole mean by capturing a moment captures us back? As dawn broke, Simon resolved to dig deeper. He needed answers, and the only way to find them was to track down his other models. Perhaps one of them could shed light on what was happening, or confirm that Michael wasn't the only one who had disappeared. Simon started with his records. He kept meticulous notes on each photo shoot, names, locations, and contact details for his models. He pulled the file for Faces of the City and began making calls. The first number he dialed belonged to Elena Martinez, a florist he'd photographed in her shop in Soho. Her portrait was one of his favorites, capturing her surrounded by vibrant flowers with her hands carefully arranging a bouquet. But now her face in the photo was nothing more than a blurred void. Simon waited as the line rang. Hello? A voice answered, but it wasn't Elena. It was deeper, male, curt. Hi, this is Simon Blake. I'm looking for Elena Martinez, he said, gripping the phone tightly. There was a pause. Elena's not here. Can you tell me where she is? Simon asked. She's gone, the man said. Left the shop about 2 weeks ago. No one's heard from her since. Simon's stomach dropped. Did she say where she was going? No. She didn't even tell me she was leaving. Just disappeared. The line clicked dead, leaving Simon staring at his phone. 2 weeks ago. That was around the same time he'd finished developing the final prints for Faces of the City. Simon's unease turned to dread as he continued his calls. One by one, he learned that his models were either missing or unreachable. A musician he'd photographed near Times Square hadn't been seen at his usual spot for over a week. A street artist from the Lower East Side had left behind her apartment, her belongings untouched. By midday, Simon's hands were shaking as he scribbled notes in his journal. Michael, Elena, the others, all gone. The common thread was clear. All of them were in his photographs. Simon stared at the prints spread across his desk. The faces, once blurred into anonymity, now seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. It was as if the photos themselves were erasing the people they captured. But why? A knock at the studio door jolted him. Simon hesitated, his heart pounding. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he approached the door and peered through the peephole. Nathan Cole stood on the other side, his sharp gray suit immaculate despite the early hour. Simon opened the door, his nerves frayed. You again? May I come in? Cole asked, his tone calm but insistent. Simon hesitated, then stepped aside. I suppose you're here to tell me I'm cursed, or something equally helpful. Cole walked inside, his gaze sweeping the studio. He stopped in front of the photographs, studying them intently. "These are remarkable," he said, almost to himself. "I didn't ask for compliments." Simon snapped. "I want to know what's happening. My models are disappearing. What do you know about this?" Cole turned to him, his expression unreadable. "More than you'd like to hear. Try me." Cole crossed his arms, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "There's a phenomenon that some call the vanishing point. It's rare, but it's happened before. Artists, painters, photographers, even sculptors, who capture something they weren't meant to see. A distortion in reality." Simon frowned. "You're saying my photographs, what? Caught some kind of supernatural glitch?" Cole nodded. "Something like that. These blurs you see, they're not just artifacts. They're disruptions, glimpses of something beyond the surface of our world. And once you open that door, it doesn't close easily." Simon's skin prickled. "That doesn't explain why my models are disappearing." "Because they're being pulled through," Cole said, "into the vanishing point. Whatever you've captured is reaching out, erasing their presence in this world." Simon's mind reeled. "Why me? Why my photos?" Cole studied him carefully. "Have you ever wondered why you see the world differently? Why you notice things others don't?" Simon felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd always had an uncanny eye for detail, for capturing moments others overlooked. But this was something far beyond his understanding. "There has to be a way to stop it," Simon said. Cole hesitated, then sighed. "There might be, but it will require going to the source." "The source," Cole nodded toward the photographs. "The vanishing point is like a black hole. Once it opens, it pulls everything toward it. If you want to save your models and yourself, you'll need to find where it's anchored and sever the connection." Simon felt his mouth go dry. "And how do I do that?" Cole's gaze darkened. "That's the hard part. You'll need to confront the vanishing point directly. And if you're not careful, it will take you too." That night, Simon sat alone in his studio, staring at the photos. His models' blurred faces seemed to shift under his gaze, the distortions writhing like smoke trapped behind glass, the vanishing point, a black hole, a doorway. Whatever it was, Simon knew he had no choice but to confront it. He flipped through his journal, tracing the locations where he had taken each photograph. A pattern began to emerge, one he hadn't noticed before. The shots formed a rough circle, all centered around one place, an abandoned subway station deep beneath the city. Simon felt a cold certainty settle over him. That was where it had started, and that was where it had to end. The subway tunnels stretched before Simon like a gaping maw, their darkness swallowing the weak beam of his flashlight. He stepped carefully, the air damp and suffused with the metallic tang of rust and decay. Behind him, Nathan Cole followed in silence, his sharp features unreadable in the flickering light. "This is where it all began," Simon said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Every photograph I took that blurred every person who vanished, it all points back to here." "The vanishing point is an anchor," Cole said, his tone calm but heavy with meaning. "It latches on to a place, feeding on those it touches. This station must have drawn your attention for a reason. It's where the veil is thinnest." Simon shivered, gripping the strap of his camera bag tightly. The bag held his prints, the ones with the blurred faces, and he felt their weight as though the photographs themselves were alive, pulsing with dark energy. They reached a rusted gate blocking the tracks, the words, "No entry," scrawled in faded paint. Beyond it, the faint glow of flickering lights seeped into the darkness. "This is it," Simon said, pushing the gate open with a loud creak. The glow led them to an abandoned platform, its walls cracked and covered in graffiti. A broken bench sat in the middle of the space, and at the far end a gaping tunnel loomed. But what drew Simon's eye most was the air itself. It shimmered like heat waves rising from asphalt, bending the light unnaturally. "That's it," Cole said, stepping forward. "The vanishing point." Simon stared, his heart pounding. The shimmer seemed alive, a pulsating vortex of distortion that tugged at his vision, making his head spin. "What do I do?" Simon asked. Cole turned to him, his expression grim. "You brought the prints?" Simon nodded, pulling them from his bag. The blurred faces stared back at him, each one a reminder of the lives that had been taken. "You'll need to confront it with these," Cole said. "The vanishing point is tied to your work. It's your connection to these people. By bringing the photos here, you might be able to sever that connection and free them. Simon hesitated, his hands trembling. And if I can't, then it takes you too, Cole said simply. Simon swallowed hard and stepped toward the vortex. The closer he got, the louder the air seemed to hum, a low, resonant vibration that rattled his bones. He could see something within the shimmer, shapes, shadows moving like figures behind frosted glass. Hello? Simon called out, his voice wavering. The shape stopped. For a moment the hum softened, and Simon thought he heard voices, faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Simon. The whisper was soft, but he recognized it instantly. Michael. Michael! Are you there? Simon stepped closer, holding up the photograph. The blurred face on the print seemed to shift, the edges twisting and writhing. The vortex pulsed, and a figure stepped forward from within, a faint, transparent version of Michael, his face still distorted but recognizable. His hands stretched toward Simon. You have to let me go, Michael whispered. We all need to go. Simon felt tears sting his eyes. How? Tell me how. Destroy the anchor, Michael said. Destroy what holds us here, the photographs, the camera. Simon's breath hitched. The camera? Behind him, Cole's voice cut through the air. He's right. Your camera captured more than just their images. It captured the connection to the vanishing point. Destroying it will sever the link. Simon turned to Cole, his hands tightening around his camera bag. That's my work, my life's work. And it's theirs, Cole said, motioning to the shimmering figures now emerging from the vortex. Dozens of blurred, ghostly forms stepped forward. His models, their faces partially erased, their hands outstretched in silent pleading. Simon's chest tightened. He looked at the camera, the device that had been an extension of himself for years. It was more than just a tool. It was his identity, the source of his success. But as he looked at the faces in the vortex, he knew the choice wasn't about him anymore. Taking a deep breath, Simon pulled the camera from the bag. What happens if this doesn't work? Simon asked, his voice shaking. Cole's expression darkened. It will work. It has to. With trembling hands, Simon placed the camera on the ground in front of the vortex. The figures inside seemed to brighten, their forms becoming more distinct. I'm sorry, Simon whispered, lifting the crowbar he had brought with him. The first swing shattered the lens, the sound like glass breaking in a silent room. The air vibrated violently, the shimmer intensifying as the vortex roared to life. Keep going, Cole shouted. Simon swung again and again until the camera was nothing more than a heap of twisted metal and broken glass. The vortex let out a deafening roar, and the platform shook beneath them. The ghostly figures began to fade, their blurred faces smoothing into peaceful expressions. One by one, they dissolved into light, their forms vanishing into the air. When the last figure disappeared, the vortex collapsed in on itself, the shimmer fading into nothingness. The platform fell silent. Simon stood there, his chest heaving, staring at the spot where the vanishing point had been. His camera, his link to the curse, was gone. But so, the blurred faces. Cole stepped forward, placing a hand on Simon's shoulder. You did it, he said quietly. Simon nodded, though the weight of what he'd lost settled heavily on his shoulders. As they climbed back up to the city streets, the first rays of dawn broke through the skyline. The curse was gone, and Simon's models were free, but he knew he would never see them again. His work, his passion, had become a sacrifice. Standing on the sidewalk, Simon looked at his hands, still stained with ink and dust from the camera. What now? He asked, his voice hollow. Cole gave him a faint smile. You start over. Sometimes that's the only way forward. Simon watched as Cole disappeared into the morning crowd, leaving him alone in the bustling city. For the first time in years, Simon didn't feel the pull of his camera or the urge to capture the world around him. Instead, he felt the quiet relief of letting go. The end.